Today's guest is one of the few triple board certified physicians in the country. He is an internationally recognized educator on the intersection of the microbiome for human health, disease, and our food production systems. His work is helping to find root cause solutions in the mega industries of big farming, big pharma, and Western medicine at large. He is an activist, an environmentalist, and he has profound spiritual wisdom that all ties into helping create a regenerative future of health for our planet and our children. Please welcome Dr. Zach Bush.
It's a pleasure to be here. Thanks for having me on.
I am so grateful to have you here today. I feel like your message and everything that you stand for needs to be heard. And I'm actually shocked that it's not already, based on some of the data and the science that I've heard you talk about. It's frightening.
Yeah.
And I guess that's where I would like to start is how, I think all my people know that I struggle with rheumatoid arthritis, and I've always been looked into the connection of what I'm eating and, trying to eat right, and then the spiritual practice. But, what you talk about is the connection between the soil and degenerative illness.
Yeah.
So can you give us a little bit of history as to what happened? How did our soil get so depleted? What's going on?
Yeah, and maybe we can start at really what is the definition of soil or maybe nutritional health, like gut health. We talk about gut health on every magazine in the world now, and we talk about the importance of organic and all these things. But when you go and ask somebody, what's the definition of gut health? It's kind of like, well, maybe it's about bacteria, is maybe as far as you'll get now, because the probiotic industry has convinced people that bacteria are part of that piece. But in the end, what you're really talking about when you talk about soil or gut health is biodiversity. Mm-hmm. And if you don't have biodiversity in a plot of soil, you become very vulnerable to nutrient deficiency in those plants that would grow there. And then you become prone to the invasion of, the necessity for weeds, the necessity for bacterial or fungal processes in the plant, viruses attacking the plant. All those seeming vulnerabilities are really demonstrating a lack of biodiversity, and the biodiversity then comes in to address that lack. And then we go and try to kill it back, thinking, this is attacking the plants, so more herbicides, more pesticides, which attack. When in reality, we're just adding fuel on the original fire, which was we were lacking biodiversity, therefore the weeds came in, therefore the bacterial and viral kingdom came back in to kind of try to create that biodiversity. And so we need to stop beating back biodiversity in soil and ultimately in gut health as well. Probiotics are an interesting world. I think they were important helping blow open the mind of the consumer and scientists, physicians to think, okay, maybe there are good bacteria. Like as of 40 years ago, the general mindset was all bacteria are bad. We're human, we're trying to keep those bacteria out. And so we developed the whole antibiotic era that everybody's so well steeped in now. And then we find out now in the last 10 years of, oh my gosh, you cannot have a human cell thrive without microbiome, without bacteria, fungi, viruses, all of this in concert supporting that human cell or that human body. And so we're suddenly realizing we cannot live in a sterile petri dish. We would die instantly in that sterility. And in fact, we can show this in cancer. For example, women with breast cancer have a very predictable bacteria in the breast of the cancer and a totally different bacterial species dominant in the healthy breast. It's a new paradigm where we're understanding that there's healthy bacteria in a breast. That's fascinating. Like we used to think that it should be limited to the skin, limited to the gut, maybe your sinuses, but certainly shouldn't have bacteria in the breast or in the brain or in the prostate. And we're starting to realize all these organ systems are thriving within the context of an ecosystem that even moves through the body like that. And so interestingly, when we found out that this methylobacterium was enriched in the breast cancers, and it was all breast cancers. It wasn't like estrogen positive or progesterone ones. It was just like, this is the bacteria of breast cancer. And so suddenly it was like, well, this must be the bacteria causing cancer. Maybe cancer is just an infectious disease in the end. So then they started to do genomic analysis of those really aggressive tumors versus relatively benign tumors and how much of the methylobacterium was present. And they found the reverse of their theory, which was the more sterile that tumor got, the more likely it was to kill the woman.
Wow.
Whereas the more methylobacterium present, the more the woman was protected from that cancer. Wow. And so when a cancer occurs, the microbiome moves in to support the woman's health and protect her from that cancer, which I find fascinating. We are so cared for by this nature that we live in. We are nurtured by the very microbiome that we've been battling against for the last 150 years of modern medicine. And so I think it's been a humbling journey as scientists, but especially as physicians, because we've been dumping antibiotics into our patients at an insane rate, right? Currently in the United States, we prescribe 833 prescriptions of antibiotics for every 1,000 man, woman, and child. 833 for every 1,000.
Wow.
I think the only reason that plateaued 15 years ago is we literally cannot get more antibiotic into the hands of Americans. We have saturated our capacity to get those antibiotic prescriptions into those hands. But if 83% of the population is seeing an antibiotic in a year, and unfortunately many of those are seeing multiple courses of antibiotic in a year, right? And we see this compiling damage done. One course of antibiotics in a year raises major depression rates by about 25% in the next 12 months. 2 courses of antibiotics in a year, you've got a 50% increase in major depression. And so your brain stops working, your breast cancer protection stops working. Like when we make you sterile, your physiology starts to collapse. And so this is really a new era where we're starting to see that soil in necessity for its microbiome mimicking this gut and its necessity for this diverse microbiome. And until we come to grips with the fact that we have to live in a complex web of nature, we are going to continue to annihilate our potential for life.
And I've heard you say some of the science, the data that you said, how many years at this rate?
Yeah, we've got about 70 years left as human beings. We've been here for 200,000 years, give or take a few. And so we're in our last chapter for sure of the behavior that we've actually been engaged with since the beginning of really the 180,000 years at least, which is we tend to kill everything else around us. Like we're very egocentric kind of mindset. Goes way back into primitive, cultures and everything else. We simply kill stuff, and we have really struggled to understand balance of nature. But if you then look at the native cultures, the Native American First Nation peoples that were here before the Western civilization kind of showed up on this continent, certainly they were in a more homeostatic state than would happen in the 100 years after Western involvement and the wipe out of the bison and all of this. So there was better homeostasis, but really, if you read the book Sapiens recently, beautifully written and everything else, you get to see that even hundreds of thousands of years ago, we were wiping out large animals on every continent that we settled. And so we have this pattern of warfare kind of mentality. We're going to kill everything that's not human out there. And we didn't really see that much detriment to our health until, interestingly, we stopped warring again, or we turned our attention from warring on big things, and we started killing the microbiome.
Right.
And suddenly, in the 1970s, 80s, and 90s, we see this, slight uptick of chronic disease, and then between 96 and 2006, we go into that steep elbow, and then between 2006 and 2016, we see a near vertical on the rates of chronic disease, influencing our children primarily, right? So attention deficit, asthma, eczema, food allergies, autism spectrum disorder, go on down the list. And we have whole pediatric conferences focused on how to prescribe major antidepressants to 2-year-olds. If we're detecting major depression in 2-year-olds at this point, we've got a serious collapse of biochemistry, neurochemistry in our population. Indeed, we have that. And so our children certainly collapsing under the pressure of this extreme rate of chronic disease and dysfunction of their immune systems. Your condition of rheumatoid arthritis that you mentioned is, just a symptom of not something happening in your body, but a symptom of something happening on the planet itself. Mm-hmm. And so you got swept up in that phenomenon of we have eliminated the foundation for biology, life, to happen on Earth. And we're seeing it way outside of the human species effects. We're losing an estimated 20 species every 20 minutes. And so one species every 20 minutes goes to extinction now. And so this pace of annihilation of life on Earth has wiped out an estimated 40% of biology in just the last 50 years. And so we're almost halfway done with the 6th great extinction on the planet, where we'll exceed 90% wipeout of life on Earth. And we'll be swept up in that. In the next 60, 70 years, we'll be one of those species to go. That sounds like a ridiculous thing to say. How could you possibly say that? And part of it's this climate chronic disease. Autism alone, if we just took one childhood condition, the speed at which we're increasing. In 1975, 1 in 5,000 children were diagnosed with autism spectrum disorder. By 2012, that number had reached 1 in 88. And there was a lot of debate as to, amazingly, there was still debate at that time of like, well, maybe we're not really seeing an epidemic. Maybe we're just recognizing this condition and therefore diagnosing it. But I really think that anybody who's ever made that argument has never seen an autistic child in their clinic. Because, well, I have almost no faith in our Western medical capacity to screen for chronic disease in our children. The people that didn't miss that in 1976 are the mothers. There is no mom in 1976 that suddenly didn't happen to notice that their child lost verbal skills at 18 months of age, couldn't look them in the face anymore, and by 5 we're still not nonverbal. And we didn't miss that stuff. And so this is not a diagnostic dilemma, this vertical. Then from 2012 to today, we've gone from 1 in 88 to 1 in 30 kids with autism spectrum disorder. And so the speed at which we're going now has us on course to hit 1 in 3 children with autism by 2036. And so at that rate, and you just look at that one generation, 1 in 3 children with autism, we know that it takes about 2 people to generate enough resources to take care of the one. And so you've completely wiped out that entire generation, even if autism is the only disease there. Eliminate all the other ones we've mentioned so far, and then layer upon that generation a geriatric population that will be larger than any other in history, that will have an 80% burden of cancer. Today we have 50% burden of cancer. 1 in 2 Americans will be diagnosed with cancer before they die. And that doesn't count skin cancer. These are solid tumor or blood-borne cancers that are occurring. And so all of that is painting a pretty desperate and grim picture for our survival. But it's actually not that that's really underpinning the strong numbers of when we go extinct. It's our ability to reproduce. And so that's what we see in the sperm counts being a good example. Male sperm counts in all of the Western nations, outside the United States included, have seen a 52 to 57% drop in sperm counts in the last 40 years. And so where we're now, we're at about 48 million sperm per milliliter, where we were at about 140 years ago. And so now at 48, to reach that bell curve where your median is at 48 million sperm, you've got 1 in 3 males now with a sperm count below 15 million, which is the threshold for infertility. And so with 1 in 3 males infertile now in 2019, and then imagine moving this thing forward, we're going to see a situation over the next 20 years on this course that we're currently on where we could be hitting 50, 60% infertility rates in just male biology. And then female biology, I think, we've proved out over time, is even more sensitive. That menstrual cycle is one of the most sensitive endocrine features out there. And in my field of endocrinology and metabolism, I used to work at the fertility endocrine clinic at the University of Virginia. And polycystic ovarian syndrome, this was kind of 2005 to 2008, we suddenly saw this massive uptick. And by 2010, we were seeing 1 in 4 women in the United States screening positive for this polycystic ovarian syndrome. And so now, of course, we see a further acceleration of that. And I haven't seen those universal screening numbers, repeated since then. But with everything else we're seeing, it's obviously going to be at worse than 1 in 4 now, a decade later. And so we're at this extraordinary tipping point. We're at this moment in time where we either continue our current progress of distancing ourselves from nature and her patterns of behavior, her patterns of cooperative biodiversity, support for life, regenesis, healing. We keep distancing ourselves through our products that we produce, our consumer behavior, the cars we drive, the houses we live in, our separation from nature on all these levels. And then you look at our education system, we've got kids warehoused in old moldy buildings that can't touch nature throughout the day, and we're wondering why they're not thriving. And it's really stupendously ridiculous that this is what the most intelligent species on Earth has created for their environmental experience, is a chemically toxic soil producing chemically toxic plants that is going into children. And we now know that the epigenetic, the damage that's passed on genetically from one generation to another, the epigenetic damage of glyphosate, which is Roundup chemical that we use primarily, and that Roundup chemical accumulates from generation to generation, and it's damage to the phenotype. So low level exposure of a rat, you actually can't see any damage at the end of their life. Their offspring, however, start to have birth defects and chronic disease patterns. Their offspring, third generation, often are stillborn or completely deficient of immune systems by third generation. And so in 1976, we start adding this in. By 2006, by 1996, 20 years later, we see the advent of genetically modified Roundup-ready crops, and for the first time, we could really start spraying our large-scale commodity crops with this chemical. So 1996, you imagine that generation of moms suddenly eating this food, and so their generation being born, 2000 and after. By 2005, just 5 years into that journey, the CDC comes out with the announcement of this will be the first generation in American history to live shorter than their parents. Just within 5 years, we could already see the imprint of, oh my gosh, what's going on in the children? They're so sick. And now, recent article that just came out with a big universal screening that's done through the insurance companies, we're looking at 52% of American children now with a chronic disease. And so the speed at which this is accumulating, dumbfounding.
How did we get to this point? Why did we start using Roundup, Monsanto? Can you give a little bit of history of that and what that's looking like right now? Like, how did we get here? Why would we start spraying our crops with something that we know that kills the soil and everything else?
Yeah, I think at the very deep base of it, it's a problem with human psychology, is that we have an inherent and almost blind trust of technology and advancement of knowledge. We just trust that whatever the new thing is, whether it's a 5G phone or a convenient chemical to wipe out weeds so that we can now manage 10,000 acres instead of 1,000 acres. We just trust these technologies are taking us forward somehow. And so that blind trust is part of the problem, but it's coupled with this feature of human behavior, which is this extraordinary drive for convenience, right? We live convenience lifestyles. We consume convenient lifestyles. We feel overwhelmed by, the rate at which we're faced with to-dos at work, to-dos at home. You're keeping the school schedule with 32 soccer things and baseball, and then you've got swimming and lacrosse, and it's just like the given kid now who's in a high education environment is doing 4 sports or extracurricular activities on top of an 8-hour school day, on top of 2 parents working, on top of ridiculous traffic to navigate, and so at the end of the day, nobody's cooking food anymore.
Right.
And so we outsourced food and its production by 1980s, right? And so this was really a dramatic shift. So through these 2 major behaviors of kind of the convenience lifestyle and our blind trust in technology, we created the chemical companies of today. What unfolded, though, what filled that vacuum of demand, if you will, by the consumer is so bizarre. These chemical companies that now dominate the industry today were the ones that were doing chemical warfare for the 100 years before that.
That's the part that I think a lot of people don't know. I mean, I think a lot of people by now know genetically modified foods, but I don't think they know the history of where this Roundup actually came from.
Right. So Roundup's category of chemical is called the organophosphates, and organophosphates made their big debut with chemical warfare during the Vietnam era. And so Vietnam is one of the longest running wars that we've ever fought as a country. And in that 20 plus years of use in that South Asian environment, we were using Agent Orange to kill the jungles. And I find it fascinating. I'm really war history buff. I love war history. And when you look at human behavior, we've been annihilating each other through war mechanisms since our very beginnings, very, very, very beginnings. But what changed in the 1950s, 60s, 70s with Vietnam is it was the first time that we saw it necessary to start to turn our chemical warfare against nature itself. And so can you imagine, we took Agent Orange, sprayed it over jungles with airplanes, low-flying sprayers, and we're dumping this chemical across. Why? So we could wipe out the foliage of the trees in the jungle so that we could see our enemy better and so we could kill them. Mother Nature got seen for the first time, I think, as an element of war or an enemy of war. And so we started to attack Mother Nature. And I think our ultimate extinction would be justified just by that one event. Can you imagine the hubris of a military going in to spray some of the most verdant, dense ecosystems of jungle in the world? And we think of all those trees that disappeared. We literally turned them into moonscapes. It was gray dust as far as the eye could see, trees wiped low, no green, anything left, gray moonscapes. It's one thing to think about just the suffering of trees. I love trees. I think there's a real thing called tree chi. There is tree energy. And if you haven't literally hugged a tree before, you need to go do that. Like you literally need to wrap your arms around a tree and give it a long hug. Serotonin will start to release from your brain in about 30 seconds. So count 30 seconds out, and then start to get a sense of what's happening in your body as you have your arms wrapped around that entity, the energy that will start to flow through your body. So the horror of wiping out billions of trees with this chemical over that 20-year period is enough. But then imagine the monkeys, the little lizards, the tree frogs, the insects, the thousands of species of butterflies that were in those jungles. And we just went in without any sense of responsibility or ethical mindset and just blindly killed.
I think you're bringing up a really good point, though, especially now what's going on in the Amazon. But I feel like, especially back then, people are like, it's over there. So what it doesn't affect me, but what affects one of us eventually affects all of us. And I think the fact that people think that we're not all connected is an illusion. And so I feel like a lot of people weren't thinking about the monkeys and the lizards and the trees. And still now, you're kind of over there and I'm doing my thing here. And that's what I love about what you talk about, because you have the scientific data and you're a doctor and you have all this amazing wisdom, but you're so connected to Mother Earth. And I truly believe in that. That's been part of my healing, is that connection and knowing that we're actually all in this together.
Yeah.
And it's so profound once people start wrapping their head around that.
Yeah, I think that we need to very rapidly, take that sense of attention or awareness, not just from the horrific stuff we're doing on the warfare front, because we're still doing just awful stuff around the world, not just the United States, but Western civilization at large is just doing horrific things to the world through our warfare machine. But I want to compare that to the medical machine right now. And so the medical machine is currently at about $3.5 trillion a year in spending in the United States. Nobody knows what a trillion is. Like that's 1,000 billion, right? So 1,000 billion, which is 1,000 million. Which of us has $1 million in the bank? Like, you just don't see 6 zeros after a 1 ever. Right. And then suddenly you've got 9 zeros, and then you've got 12 zeros, and you start to get up in these numbers that are so obscenely large, and we're spending that not on any health and healing. Not a penny of that $3.5 trillion goes to your yoga class or to your supplements you're buying. $3.5 trillion entirely to disease management. Right. And so it's never going to improve the situation. And this was one of my major flips in my head and careers that happened is in the 2005 to 2010, I was steeped in chemotherapy research. I was developing chemotherapies for weird endocrine cancers, and very exciting time intellectually for me, but then it suddenly got whacked in the side of the reality of, in clinic every day, watching my patients decline under my drug management for diabetes and autoimmune diseases like type 1 diabetes or Hashimoto's of the thyroid or Graves' disease, all these things I was managing in the clinic, and watching people decline under my medical management. I could make their numbers look good. Right. Oh, your thyroid's fine now. Right. Well, no, my thyroid's not fine now because I feel worse than I did a year ago. And I had no tools left. I was like, well, you look good on paper, and that's all I got for you, Yeah. And so that's, I think, unfortunately, what the vast majority of consumers now going into that medical scenario are said. They're told, you have this disease, we have this fix, there's the fix, and doc, I feel worse than I did before, now what? And the answer is always like, no, well, you have this disease, and we did the best we could, and keep doing the drug that you're on. Mm-hmm. And so in the midst of that reality, I suddenly realized there had never been a single human cancer that had been caused by a lack of chemotherapy. So no matter how good my chemotherapy got, no matter how brilliant I got at creating non-toxic approaches to killing cancer, I would never get to the root cause of why all this cancer was happening or how to actually cure it. And so this whole war on cancer thing that we're pumping all this money into is the wrong mentality. We're right back into the war mindset. Cancer is a normal symptom of a disconnect of cells. Cancer is the most lonely part of a human body. And we go after that with this warfare mentality, like, well, we're going to kill you. Well, if you respond by trying to kill something that's just trying to live, it's going to work a lot harder to live. Whereas if we saw, oh my gosh, there's a symptom of disconnect. There's a part of your body that's literally disconnected from the rest of your body. We need to get connection back. How will we do that? Let's increase communication. So my lab's been working on, understanding how the microbiome, the biology of our gut and our soils and everything else actually creates a wireless network to help cell-cell communication happen in humans. And this finally closes the loop of how is it that we kill the microbiome and then human gets sick? It's because the human cells can no longer communicate. A human cell with unfettered access to information never gets cancer. In fact, if it gets too damaged that it can't, thrive, or if it gets too damaged that it actually gets to a point of a cancer cell, it kills itself. You don't need an immune system to do that. The cancer itself realizes, oh, can't fix myself. I'm too damaged. There's a larger organism here. I need to get it out of the way. Stem cell call in, replace me. All is good. If the cell doesn't know that the rest of the organism is there, all it knows is it's supposed to survive. And so a tumor is literally a highly damaged and vulnerable cell doing everything in its power to survive because it thinks it's the last semblance of you. And so we got to love these diseases back into our bodies. And I think that that's kind of what you've done with your RA. When we sat down here, you mentioned, I feel I can now thrive with this condition, but I am not cured of this condition.
Right.
And in some ways, I believe that you have the opportunity to probably live longer than your compatriots because you have a super sensitive barometer on your day now.
Absolutely.
You know exactly, if you don't move for 2 hours, you're going to be stiff and those joints are going to hurt. You got to keep moving. And most of us don't have that sensitive of a barometer. And so we can decline and decline for decades before we suddenly realize I have advanced end-stage heart disease or I have a cancer.
Yeah.
And I didn't know it because I didn't have that sensitive barometer. And so I really try to help all my patients realize, oh my gosh, I've been looking at this thing as my enemy the whole time.
Right.
I need to welcome this into my life. This is my journey. This is my path that my body is living out. I need to accept that, and I need to step into that space and love myself back into myself. And if I do that, I'm going to have a totally different journey that will not be littered with fear, guilt, and anger towards my own body or towards a medical system or whatnot. But let's again look at the warfare mentality. $3.5 trillion of warfare against chronic disease. And we now look at the entire defense war budget of the United States is only $680 billion. And so our entire war machine is 5 times smaller than our war on cancer and all of these other things now. That number of $3.5 trillion is expected to hit $5.5 trillion by 2025. So with our next president, we will hit $5 trillion or more spending with our chronic disease management. And this is what's going to bankrupt our nation, is we will lose productivity. It's estimated right now that we're losing, I think it's $600 billion a year in productivity from workers due to chronic disease now. And so we're losing, it's actually in excess of that, is around $690 billion. We're losing more in productivity from workers who have chronic disease now than we spend on the entire military budget. And so that's a fascinating number to me of like, wow, we have all this debate of are we spending too much on national defense and military and all that. We're literally losing that much money every year by just, I can't get to work because I've got a crippling migraine, my autoimmune is flared, my cancer's back, my major depression keeps me in bed and I can't move. I haven't slept in 3 weeks, my insomnia is so bad. I have no sex drive and my marriage is falling apart, and you can go on and on and on. That whole pressure cooker that humanity's in, productivity going like this, chronic disease going like this, reproductive capacity going like this, it just doesn't take a rocket scientist or a mathematician to figure out, holy smokes, we made it. We finally made it as a species to our tipping point. And in this tipping point, we only have 2 options: continue on the course or transform literally everything.
What do we do? I mean, now, I don't know if a lot of people realize that the biggest pharmaceutical company now basically owns our food production system, and which is Bayer, and which seems like this loophole because this glyphosate is what's actually causing all these illnesses. So then we're going to need the medication. So it's like this loophole. So we've painted this horrible, grim picture and all of these, sad statistics. What is the solution? What do we do? I mean, I feel like you said a little bit earlier, like every decision we make, I feel like has an impact. The food that you buy, who you're spending time with, who you're having dinner with, who you're having meals with, what you're doing outside. You're talking about breathe your biome every day, get in different environments and stuff like this. So these are like little tools that I think we can do. But on the bigger picture, what can we do to stop this?
Yeah, it's a critical question. We have to come up with these marching orders, these calls to action immediately as a nation and as a species. Obviously, these things, it's kind of dumbfounding that here we have one of the busiest presidential candidacy clouds that we've ever had racing for the presidency, and yet none of this stuff that I just said is really forefront to any of this discussion.
Nobody's talking about it.
And so nobody's talking about, I mean, to say nobody, it's not right. There's people who are running that are trying to talk about chronic disease and all this, but what captures the headlines is none of this, right? And so these poor politicians, even the ones that are, right-minded about this situation, are not given the airtime on these subjects because it's just doomsday, it sounds like, and that's not a good political platform. You want to talk about better schools or better roads and road systems and more support to farmers and military, and these are your catchphrases. But nobody is equipped to say, wow, we just wiped out the whole foundation for biology on Earth and life is collapsing and we need to hurry up and shift that. And so that the topics at hand, and interestingly, come down to that microbehavior you were just talking about. How do we do a huge shift? And before we run through a quick list of things that we can each do, I think, to accelerate this transformation as a species and as a society, I think we would be really wise to just stop for a moment and just do some breathing, right? I think that the story we just told can induce anxiety and a sense of desperation. At the same time, it can be really affirmational of like, I knew that was going on. I knew something was underpinning what's going on in my family or my own life or whatever it is, and what a relief. So there can be that kind of angst or that cognitive dissonance between what a relief to know that this is the problem and underpinning it, and then, but holy cow, that sounds completely out of my capacity to change any of that. So it's a sense of terror. And so stopping for a minute altogether and just reflecting on the fact that we're here on purpose. This journey that we're doing as humans, this 200,000-year journey, had its endpoints mapped out at the beginning, and we've marched down one pathway and we keep selecting for that pathway more and more intensely. But it's been our journey for great purpose. And what I find my patients doing, I think, is a microcosm of what we could do as a society. My patients, when they start to stop and breathe for a minute, most of the time they can tell me exactly why that disease showed up in their life. What were the things they were doing that caused that vulnerability? But more importantly, what has that disease done for them? And a year, 2 years into these cancer journeys that I take care of all the time, it's very unusual that I don't hear, this was the most important thing that ever happened to me. My cancer was the greatest gift that ever came into my life.
Goosebumps, yeah.
And you don't hear that in the halls of an oncology ward at MD Anderson and all this. Like, you're in the war mentality there. And if you're not winning it, you're losing it. What we see in my clinic all the time is patients that will live and die despite their cancer. They're going to live and die in a new space where they have a sense of purpose and a sense of connectivity, a sense of awareness of their journey and how it's been perfect in its own joys, pains, losses, heartbreaks, overwhelming sense of love, loneliness, all of these things that array through a human experience. It's a beautiful tapestry of life. And if we start to address humanity in that way, and we start to say, this is going to be a beautiful journey, we're going to stop fearing one another, we're going to start welcoming biodiversity at every level of life. And that's going to begin with, what do I do the first moment I wake up? If I wake up and tuck in and cuddle in harder to my four walls of the drywall house, and then finally stumble into my plastic off-gassing car and then drive to my cubicle, and you never touch nature, you're going to die in isolation and loneliness of nature. Whereas if you get up in the morning and you take off your shoes and walk outside and just for a few minutes walk through the grass, touch Mother Earth for just a couple seconds, and then just express in deep gratitude, oh my gosh, I'm so glad I'm alive today. I can't believe I'm still here on this human experiment. I'm so excited to be a part of this. And so I think if we bring in the templates of gratitude and nature into each element, what does your office environment need to do now? Now that you know that nature is your only template for life beyond where you're at today, what are you going to do for that working environment? Stop going to the Starbucks or whatever it is to sit down with your laptop or the working group and start maybe thinking about what that look like in the park. Like, well, maybe I should just make sure that 2 or 3 days a week the park is my office and I'm doing that instead. Or maybe I need to make sure that I stop taking these vacations that are in four-star hotels and high rises and all this, and I need to start taking vacations that are on the back of a cow in Asia, and I'm just like in the mud, experiencing adventure land in the jungles of Asia or South America or close to home. I live in Virginia part-time, and that's where my clinic's at, and I send a lot of my patients down into the Great Smokies. It's one of the most ancient ecosystems on the planet. It's older than the Amazon jungle. And so you can go, touch ferns that are literally millions of years old. And that opportunity to touch the intelligence of nature at that depth and that level of wisdom is extraordinary. If you can't get there, for God's sake, just go hug that tree in the neighborhood or in your backyard or whatever it is, and just start to touch it, and be silent in front of it. And you're going to find out that your drive to go buy that next thing on Amazon is going to dive as soon as you hug a tree. Like suddenly that just lost priority. You didn't need a 20-second bathing suit. You didn't need whatever it is. You needed yet another moment, another precious moment to touch Mother Nature in some small way. Marvel over her little things. Like, ladybug is such a fascinating, kind of creature within this large species of the beetle that it sits within. But that little bug, if you just watched a ladybug for 60 seconds, it would change your latitude. It would change your sense of purpose itself, because that little thing certainly has purpose. It's there and knows exactly what it's doing at any moment. It has no doubt about its ladybugness. There's no doubt about what it's here to do. And so in the end, my mission right now is coming alongside big corporations like the mega farms and help them make this transition away from the chemical dependence. And we started Farmers Footprint, which is a big nonprofit that's bringing attention to our ability as consumers to support these farmers who frankly need a change. They know they've got to change. They know they're using poisons and toxins, but their toolbox sucked. We're not giving. Same thing, you go to the doctors, they want to help you. I've never really met a doctor that really was out to harm anyone. Right. We want to help you, but our toolbox sucks. And so we've got to start to look at the opportunity to really change those toolboxes. And so farmersfootprint.us, you can go there and see that initial 20-minute documentary in the series that we're producing to get a sense of the farmer's story. Because I think until you know what the farmer's plight is in their situation, you really can't figure out how to help them. Right. It's not as simple as I just need to go to the farmer's market. It's more I need to be part of a new economy that's not dependent on the banks and the crop insurance that keeps these farmers pinned down to GMO corn, soybean, and the like. And so we've got to be able to become bigger advocates for this food industry and food system. You do that certainly by voting with your dollar at the grocery store, so the more organic you buy, better. However, it was decimating for me to find out that much of the dirt and soils on organic farms are worse off than chemical farms, because no place in that 30-point checklist of becoming organic does it mention soil health or nutrients. And so neither nutrition or soil health is addressed in the organic certification. All it says is don't spray this, don't spray that, don't spray this, but you can spray all of this and you can overtill. And so overtilling tends to be a huge problem for soil health. And so we are teaching a new phenomenon, which is this regenerative agricultural system where you're bringing in biodiversity through multi-species cover crops. Instead of doing some sort of alfalfa or some other one species monocrop of cover, you're now doing 32 species of cover crops, which immediately brings butterflies and brings up the earthworms. And then you get cattle not to eat, you get cattle to work with you. Cattle used to be our workers. We turned them into meat commodities and that was it. They were supposed to be our co-workers on the farm, and when we turn them out into a pasture or a paddock of 32 species cover crops, they immediately bring in biodiversity. They bring in the flies, the grubs, they bring in a whole diverse spectrum of parasites and worms that will come up to address their stool that's coming out, and these cow patties sitting all over that become their own ecosystems. And within 12 months, we've reversed 17, 18 years of chemical spraying damage, and we have the healthiest soil that's happened in generations on that farm in 12 months. 12 months. And that's our salvation, is that we heal biologically faster than we harm. We are so resilient. Life is so impenetrably resilient that of course it will heal faster than it damages, because it has mechanisms of repair always in play. And so as we pour chemicals into the farm that ends up in your children's bodies, that end up causing chronic disease, it takes decades for those to emerge because the body is healing, trying to keep up with the toxicity. And so we have this ratio of how fast are you injuring to how fast are you healing. And right now, as humanity, we're here. All we've got to do is level that out. And if we could equal it, suddenly we would plateau this vertical climb in chronic disease. So we just have to heal heal faster and injure slower, even out that ratio. But imagine for a moment, what if we tipped it a little further where we were healing faster than we were injuring, and suddenly we become healthier than we were 5 years ago. And we accelerate that, or we just hold that pace another 10 years, and we become healthier than we were 50 years ago. We accelerate that for 200 years in the future, and we could create a Garden of Eden that hasn't existed since 60 million years ago. The extinction of the dinosaurs was the first massive collapse or the most recent massive collapse of the ecosystems on the planet. And so we're now mimicking that behavior. But we could go back to that verdant jungle around the world of 60 million years ago. And one of my companies specializes in pulling the nutrients and the wireless communication from the microbiome out of those fossil soils that are 60 million years old. And when we touch human cells with that and you drink it as a dietary supplement, when you get that experience, your body does things that our biology hasn't done in 60 million years. And we see healing accelerate at this insane rate. Not because the compound of the supplement is healing you, it's giving you the communication needed that your body does what it does best, which is accelerate the healing process. So I don't care if it's a plot of damaged chemical destroyed land or your body that's inundated with those chemicals, healing happens and healing happens fast. My favorite thing about healing, though, is that it doesn't lead to cure, because there is really no such thing as disease. Disease is just a symptom description of a lack of health. And so you're never off the hook. This isn't like I'm going to go be healthy for a year and then I'm going to go back to doing what I was because I feel better. No, you're going to change life only. You're going to survive as a species only if you change that trajectory and hold that trajectory for the next 200 years and see where we go from there. And if we're alive in 200 years, we will have changed everything. Every single consumer product will be based on a template of nature, not on a template of convenience and fossil fuels. Every single lifestyle environment will be based on a template of nature. Schools will not look like the schools we have today. They will be outside. They will be integrated into nature. Our workplaces will be integrated into nature. I have a feeling that we'll be in a space where we'll be doing quantum computing with fungi. Fungi will be helping us understand quantum think, quantum and quorum sensing as not just a species, but as a planet. And we could rise to a level of intelligence on this planet, integrating Mother Nature's template for how we communicate, how we do this massive hyperintelligence that we're capable of when we all interconnect via nature's pattern rather than 5G networks.
Yes. I feel like so much of what you talk about is really going back to how I imagined it used to be at one point, where we're growing our own food, we're outside, we wake up with the sun, go to bed with the moon. We're not on, all these technologies and these smartphones. We're actually talking with our family. Our hands are in the soil. We're putting everything into the food and everything, and we're sitting with the family. All of this stuff, I feel like that's what we're missing. And it sounds like what you talk about, I've heard you say that everything leads back to the soil, whether it's Mother Nature's soil or our own gut health. And I think once we start healing that and making those little changes every single day, what we're doing right now obviously isn't working. So we need to start somewhere. And I think it could be overwhelming for people when they hear this. So just making those little changes every single day.
They change radical things, right? And so at Farmers Footprint, we've got a toolkit for you, working with Kim Conti and Safe Neighborhoods. We've got a toolkit for you to go to your school board or your local communities board to get Roundup eliminated from public spaces. So soccer fields, roadscapes, all these places where Roundup is dumped outside of our agricultural system and end up in our water systems. And we end up drinking that and we end up breathing that. 75% of our air is contaminated with Roundup. 75% of our rainfall is contaminated with Roundup. And so we have so steeped this planet in this chemical. 5 billion pounds a year are used worldwide now. And so it's just like this staggering amount of this chemical. And so what you can do is as soon as you go out and you start to breathe Mother Nature, you just stop and think, I'm breathing Roundup right now. I'm going to change that. And so take the toolkit, show them this is why we're going to eliminate it. And the toolkit has what they can replace Roundup with, non-toxic substances that they can use in streetscapes and the rest to eliminate weeds without the chemicals. And so we've got opportunity to really shift this thing at a really rapid rate as consumers. And your sense of intense drive and purpose within that kind of global mission to shift our behavior will accelerate the more time you can spend silent in nature. And so again, you're not going to hear in this podcast all of the pieces of wisdom you need to activate you towards your full potential. You literally need to go out and if there's any one thing we need to do as a species, we need to stop warring and we need to start meditating. We need silence and listening within. Every patient that I've had that will go and be silent and listen, they live longer for it because they are connecting to some rooted energy. We've been talking a lot about biology, but ultimately we're not biologic, we are biophysics machines. We are creatures of vibration, electromagnetic frequency vibration. We are literally creatures of light. Mitochondria are these little bugs that live inside of our cells. There's this microflora that lives inside of our cells, the microbiome of the intracellular environment. A cubic centimeter of these mitochondria produces 10,000 times more energy than a cubic centimeter of the sun. We are light energy, and it traffics beautifully through these tiny little tubules that look like fiber optic cables. They are fiber optic cables, and they run from cell to cell to passage light energy so that you always wake up with this 70 trillion celled organism knowing its self-identity, knowing who you are. That's extraordinary. You're so interconnected. You're this miraculous network of cooperative behavior, cooperative relationships such that you would thrive and be able to communicate like you do or move like you do, all these things. That creature right there is running on light energy. And what our lab has shown is that Roundup clips those fiber optic cables. And so the biologic injury that we get directly from Roundup is a cutting of the cables that would passage the light. And then, so now imagine a whole generation of children being born without the passage of light in their bodies. What would that generation look like? They would be anxious, they would have attention deficit, they would sensory processing, they can't make sense of their environment, they have crippling insomnia, they've got autoimmune diseases, they've got everything that they have today. We clipped the light energy of our children through a chemical that lyses these proteins. And so we need to get this chemical out of our children's soccer fields, out of their playgrounds. We got to get them out of their food. We got to get it out of the air. We got to get that done. But it's not enough to just say no Roundup, because the chemical company will respond with 1,000 other chemicals behind that one if we just rule that one out. We have to instead say no Roundup instead. Let's do bioregenesis. Let's regenerate life on the planet through a mission of biodiversification. Start a garden in your backyard. Start just one plant. If you don't have a backyard, you've got a window, then start a mint plant. Mint plants you can't kill. They're just like bulletproof. So start a mint plant. And then I would even challenge you, don't even pick the mint off the plant. Bend down like any other creature on earth would and eat that off the stem and see what that feels like. Because the mint tastes different. The water spin in that mint is actually different the moment that you pick it. And so if you pick that and throw it in a salad and eat that 20 minutes later, you have a water structure that's already encouraging decay. Whereas if you eat it right off the plant, it's in a regenerative spin. It's growing. It's fueling. I'm pretty convinced that we may find the day very soon where we are encouraging people to have gardens and they have to go out every morning and eat at least 4 tomatoes and a cucumber off the vine because they have to get that regenerative water structure back into their body. Dehydration is eaten better than it is drank. Water itself doesn't hydrate well. You've got to have all of the electrolyte and the balance of nutrients within that water to make it really intelligent and make it really bioavailable. A cucumber is a way better hydration event than a glass of water from the tap. And so we need to start eating our hydration again, and to do that, we would need to get back into these gardens. And so a farmer's market is a step in the right direction. I think a CSA is more exciting, where you go out as a community member and you participate in that farm. And so on the weekends, you're picking in that farm. You've got your kids running up and down those dirt aisles between the rows, and they're experiencing what it tastes like to eat a tomato that's just off the vine and just experience that. They'll never think of a tomato again the same, obviously. Any adult that says my child doesn't like vegetables, it's because that kid's never been farming. The kid's never been gardening. A kid who gardens loves to eat the stuff that the kids are fascinated by being able to just eat randomly. That's fascinating. Like, what? I can just eat that thing right there. You can see this in a 2-year-old. What is a 2-year-old? It sticks every damn thing they can find in their mouth. They're curious. We forgot about the curiosity and the sensuality of the mouth. And so we have been just putting drug in this mouth for decades, and we forgot that this is our most sensual organ. Kissing is really weird. Why the hell do we kiss each other? That just seems ludicrous to smush these lips together. And it's because this sensory processing in this face is really targeted at this mouth so that we could have a sensual experience with our interaction with nature through food. And I think this is a huge piece that we're missing from our concept of nutrition. I'm so exhausted of the arguments of paleo versus vegan versus, South Beach versus protein versus carbohydrates versus fat. That's all missing the point so vastly. Recently, I had this extraordinary meal prepared by this husband-wife team from Ikaria, Greece. 5-course Greek meal. She spent 3 days foraging for the ingredients for this meal. and she prepared this beautiful meal, and it was a group of kind of speakers on this subject and everything else. So I got up to toast them at the end, and I thought I was so clever. I had this little microbiome, a little synopsis, and like what we would just experience in this amazing meal and connection with nature. And it was like, I just thought, wow, I was so eloquent. And this guy gets up, and the husband stands up and says, "Thank you very much, but you're completely wrong." And I was like, "Oh, shoot." And he said, "In Korea, we know it's not the food. It has nothing to do with the food. It has nothing to do with the nutrients you're talking about. I don't even know what you're talking about, microbiome. It's nothing to do with that." He said, "You never ever ask somebody in Korea agrees what they had for dinner last night. Instead, every morning you ask them, who did you eat dinner with last night?" And that just stopped me in my tracks of like,
so important.
Oh my gosh, we missed the point. This is a central organ meant to share a spiritual experience of a meal together, such that we would then communicate to one another. I have loneliness and love in me, and this is my experience today. I have joy and heartbreak in me today. This is my experience today. The food is not there for nutrients. The food is an avenue to spiritual fellowship.
Bring everyone.
It's the center point to bring us back together. So it's devastating when you look at the statistics of how many meals are consumed alone in a car today in the United States. It breaks your heart. We're so damn lonely, and we miss touch. And even this, the environments we're taught to do these shows in are so opposite of what we should be doing. I think that really, what this should probably look like is something more like, it's like right up in it, and we're just like amazed by each other all the time, and we're just all up in it, and we're so excited.
Sitting in the grass.
Yeah, and just fascinated by each other. Like, oh my gosh, I can't believe that's your face. Like, this is my face. Isn't it weird? You want to touch that weird face? Like, this is like, we're so sterile. We're programmed into like, this is how life should be. But you look at any other species, like dogs, God bless the example they give us. What do dogs do as soon as they meet each other? Strange dog, I'm going to go sniff his butt.
I always think of that, yeah.
Sniff your butt. Like they are the masters of the microbiome. They know who this other organism is, they need to understand the complexity of the ecosystem of that animal. And by smelling the butt end of that other dog, they immediately get this download of, oh, this dog was over on that block the other day and ate something because I can smell the bacteria that was there with them. And I understand the role that this dog plays in its environment. I really believe that the nose of the dog is picking up all of that intelligence when they sniff each other's butts. And then, of course, they go and jump up and lick our faces. And so fecal transplant is not a new thing. It's been happening since the moment we domesticated the dog. They've been giving us fecal transplants in the face all day long. And so we're getting this download of microbiome from the animals in our environment. And if we think back to maybe the origins of humanity, we were obviously integrated into that. When we look at the last hunter-gatherers on Earth over in West Africa right now, these tribes, their microflora of their gut is the most diverse thing we've ever seen. But interestingly, you can find that they have a very rich involvement of bacteria that can only be found on the hides of zebras. So the hunter-gatherers, they find a zebra, they kill the zebra, they have to quarter the zebra, the hide is then carried back with the quartered animal for a day or two back to the tribe. And so these people are covered with the microbiome of the zebra. And they're very central people. And so when the Hadza tribe gets back together, they're all kissing each other and hugging each other, and they're all naked on each other. The kids are on each other's shoulders and on the adults' backs, and they're just like on each other. And so zebra is now part of that human experience, and they are eating zebra with the microbiome of the zebra. Of course that food is going to agree with them. They're not vegans, they are zebra.
Right.
They aren't plant eaters, they aren't anything. They are part of the ecosystem. They're a continuation of that. And so when we never touch our food source, I don't care if you're eating a tomato or a piece of kale or a hamburger, if you have no connection to the microbiome and the experience and the energetics of the growing of that, the sunshine that came down to fuel that, the fresh water that got sucked up into that plant. If you haven't dove into a freshwater stream recently, I come from Boulder, Colorado, and those high mountain streams that I grew up in, like there's something to that, like brutally cold water that you touch that is so invigorating. Or if you've not jumped into a waterfall in Hawaii or wherever it is, go out and experience water and understand its relationship to that cucumber, and then eat that cucumber with a sense of gratitude for Mother Earth, the sun, the water, the soul of all of it. And then you have health incarnate coming into your body, and you remember why you're human. You aren't human to be human. You're human to be the sensory processing unit of life on Earth. Our brains are not supposed to be experiencing an isolated human experience. Our brains are so interconnected with the nature around us. We now know that the microbiome is responsible for making the neurotransmitters in our gut lining that would become a thought. There's no such thing as original human thought. There is Mother Nature expressing itself, and we get intelligence out of that. Scientists are the best example of this. No scientist ever came up with a new idea. Scientists makes observation after observation after observation. We're these observational tools. We're a sensory processing unit. We are the central CPU chip of nature itself. And if we don't wake up to that role, then nature's going to just give up on us, pass us by, and live into its full potential, and the fungi will rise, and they will dominate that communication network. Whatever needs to happen, we are given right now the opportunity to be a central processing unit. We are the sensory experience of Mother Nature, and if we don't realize from that moment that we are called to co-create with her, we will miss our opportunity, I really believe. And so I have this just, well, you can sense it. I'm just crazy. I'm very excited about our potential as humans. And so I hope that this podcast has confused the hell out of you and has really got you really wondering, well, what am I supposed to do tomorrow? If you wonder one thing, or if you remember one thing, just shut up for a minute. Shut off the radio. Shut off the everything else. And just at the end of this podcast, just sit there for a few minutes, park the car, turn off the lights in the house, wherever you're at right now. Take this utter moment of silence. It's a gift you need to give yourself right now. Realize that every thought you had today is really irrelevant. It doesn't have any influence on the future of our species. Give up everything you had today and create a new canvas, a blank slate for the future of your life, your purpose, that we can emerge on that fresh canvas without the baggage of these previously held beliefs, behavior patterns, habits, all of these things. You're going to let all that go, surrender that for a moment, and think about a completely new way to start your day tomorrow. And it should probably have something to do with gratitude, and it should have something to do with Mother Nature.
The only way out is in. And you've already answered my question, but I want to see if I could get anything else out of you. I always ask all my guests, what is your golden secret?
Holy smokes, what is my golden secret? I think I ultimately just gave you the golden secret. I think the golden secret that is brewing within me is the concept of space. When we start to live with that extra breath between the words, and understanding that the words don't carry the wisdom, the space between the words carries the wisdom. It's who's ever speaking between my words that spoke to you today. Give up on holding so firmly to what you can see and start to understand it's only a semblance of what is unseen. And so shut down your dependence on your visual experience, shut down your dependence on the physical nature around you, and start to dive deep into the invisible nature around you. And the scientific discoveries that me and my group have been able to make as we do that have been extraordinary, life-changing. They've changed hundreds of thousands of households around the world, and we're just humbled by that experience. But ultimately, none of that came from my intelligence or anybody else in the lab's intelligence. It came from this just trust that the answers were already right in front of us, and we just had to stop trying to micromanage the outcomes. And we needed to just fully trust Mother Nature to reveal herself. So trust and gratitude towards that Mother Nature will be discovered when you shut up, when you shut down the human behavior around you and listen to Mother Nature's version.
I love that. Thank you so much for being here today. I am so grateful and honored. And everybody's going to check out Farmer's Footprint and, of course, Restore, which is I take every day, and start making these little micro changes. And eventually, it's like the butterfly effect.
The butterfly.
It will make a huge
We'll go change the world. Let's go build that Garden of Eden.